In today's show, I'm going to give you 4 ways to get closer to the action in wildlife photography without getting physically closer. But I warn you, it comes with a price. Hey everyone, welcome into Magnolia Photography SC. I'm Jeff House and I'm a wildlife photographer in Charleston, South Carolina. We have a lot to cover today, so I want to jump right into it. Again, we're going to be talking about 4 ways that you can get closer to the action in wildlife without getting physically closer to the animals, the birds, whatever you're photographing. And I don't care how long you've been doing wildlife. I don't care how expensive your gear is. I've never met a wildlife photographer, including myself, who doesn't wish or doesn't long for getting closer to the action, getting closer to the animals and the wildlife that we're photographing. That just seems to be something that comes with the territory, right? I'm sure we can all relate to it for any of us who've been doing wildlife photography for any length of time. Now, these 4 ways I told you come with a price. And I want to start by going down the 4 ways. And we're going to start with the worst way first. This is going to be number 4. This is the worst way that you can get closer to wildlife, but it is an option for you. And number 4 is called optical zooming. What is optical zooming? Well, I first want to talk about the difference between crop sensor cameras and full frame cameras. And I know that many of you probably already know this information, but for those people out there who are listening and watching, and they're not necessarily all that familiar with these terms or what it means exactly, I just want to go through a quick explanation so that we can just make sure that everyone moving forward is on the same page. Let's first deal with full frame cameras. For those of you not familiar with this, a full frame camera is simply a camera that has the same size sensor as the old 35 millimeter cameras used to. It's a 36 by 24 millimeter sensor. And it gives you the largest field of view. And then we have a crop sensor camera. Now this camera has a much smaller sensor than that found in a full frame. It's actually, I believe, 22 by 14 millimeters is what it is on the crop sensor. And this smaller sensor also gives you what they call it a crop sensor because it gives you a crop factor, meaning that the field of view will be a little bit narrower when you compare it to that of a full frame camera. So you get a little extra reach from the camera. Now that can be an advantage or a disadvantage in wildlife photography, but let's talk about field of view first. What does that mean? If we were to put, just for argument's sake, if we were to put a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame camera, we're going to get 50 millimeters for our field of view. But if we put that same lens on a crop sensor body, our field of view is now going to change to 75 millimeters, roughly, right? It all depends on the camera manufacturer that we're talking about. But generally speaking, most camera manufacturers have a crop factor of 1.4 to 1.5 times whatever your focal length is. Now, that doesn't seem like such a big deal if we're talking about 50 millimeters, but what if we're talking about 600 millimeters? That makes a big, big difference. And yes, the crop sensor is nice in the fact that it gives you that extra reach. So if you had a 600 millimeter lens on a crop sensor camera, you're now going to turn that into 840 millimeters. That's a lot of extra reach, and that's a great way to get a little bit closer to the animals. The problem is, as you increase your focal length in wildlife photography, it becomes increasingly more difficult to get your subject inside of the frame. So if you're zoomed into 600 millimeters, but it's really acting as 840, and you have a flying bird in your scene, I guarantee you it's going to be extremely difficult, if nearly impossible, to get that bird in the frame and get a nice, sharp photo of it. So those are kinds of the advantages and disadvantages of the crop sensor and its field of view. But the reason that I wanted to cover those quickly is for this reason. Optical zooming is a feature that I have in my Sony A1 camera, and it's found in a lot of other full frame cameras. Essentially what optical zooming does is it turns your full frame camera into a crop sensor. So I can simply turn this feature on, or I can program it to a button. And when I push that button, I can either turn it on or off. But what I can do is I can zoom into my 600 millimeters. If I need a little extra reach, I can push that programmed button and I will get another 1.5 times reach to it, right? So I can turn that 600 into 840. But here's the catch. Here is the price that you are paying to use optical zooming and why you really want to avoid it at all costs. If I'm using my Sony A1 camera to photograph something, and I am typically photographing in the raw, uncompressed file format, when I take my picture, I get a picture that comes out at 49.8 megapixels. That's a lot of megapixels, right? That allows me to do a lot of different things with a file size that big. Now, if I decide that I want to use that APS-C mode in my camera and turn my camera into a crop sensored camera, I take that same picture. Guess how many megapixels that picture now is? 21. We are giving up a ton of resolution to bring that feature into play. So if you want to take your full frame camera and you want to optically zoom it by using that crop sensor feature, you're going to lose a lot of resolution. And what that means is later on, when you get into post-processing, guess what? You really don't want to crop it. You want to make sure that if you're going to go to that crop sensor format, that you've got that image framed perfectly and you don't plan on cropping it anymore. Because when we go into post-production and we crop that digitally, now we're going to take more resolution away from that photo. And when all is said and done, we may not even have enough resolution to really get a decent print out of it. Yeah, we can probably get an 8x10, maybe an 11x14, if we're lucky, depending on how much we crop and how much resolution we strip from the image. Or you may not be able to get much more than a 4x6 or a 5x7, depending on what you do. But these are things that we need to consider when we're looking at that optical zooming. Loss of resolution. That's almost 30 megapixels of resolution on my Sony A1 simply by going from the raw the raw compressed to the APS-C mode. So big difference. Don't recommend it. Number 3, guys, is digital zooming or digital cropping. So this is something that most of us are going to be familiar with, right? This is the type of cropping that we're doing when we bring our images into our favorite photo editing software. Now, I've been around photography for a long time, as I'm sure many of you have. I don't think there's a program out there, whether it's paid or free, that doesn't offer digital cropping, right? Every program, no matter how cheap it is, typically comes with this function. But as much as we rely on cropping, as much as wildlife photography relies on cropping to get closer to our animals and closer to the subject, this too comes with a price. Now, the price isn't as severe as optical zooming, but digital cropping is definitely going to reduce your image by quite a few megapixels if you're doing some fairly heavy cropping, which again, we're often doing in wildlife photography. So, I find that with my, 49 megapixel images, when I bring them into post-production and I crop them, I tend to have, and I think we all do, we have a certain crop style. And so our images tend to look very similar as far as that's concerned. And most of the cropping that I do, and I would say that I do a fairly heavy crop on a lot of my wildlife photos. But when I'm said and done, most of my photos are falling somewhere between that 28 to 32 megapixel range. Now, that is still a considerable amount of reduction to the overall resolution of the photo, right? Think about it. We started at 49 and we're going down to somewhere between 28 and 32. That's pretty significant. That is pretty significant, but it's not as significant as going all the way down to 21. And then if we crop there, we go down even further. So it would be very common if we were to crop one of those photos that we take in our camera when we're using the crop sensor mode, be nothing for us to wind up with a image that's somewhere between 10 and 15 megapixels. Now, if we do the same thing again with the raw compressed image, we're 28 to 32. There's a lot of extra resolution there. That's going to give us a lot of different options when it comes to how we want to print and use our photos in real life. Okay, guys, let's talk about number 2. This is the second way that you can get closer to your subjects, to your animals, to your wildlife. Let's talk about this option. We've talked about it a lot before on this channel, but you can use a teleconverter. Now, a teleconverter is a piece of equipment that attaches to your camera's mount. And then on the other side of that teleconverter is another connection, and that's where you would attach your lens. So you have this piece between your camera and your lens, and that piece has some glass in it. So it'll basically act as a magnifying glass. And this is what allows you some extra reach. Now, I'm in the Sony ecosystem, and Sony offers a couple of different teleconverters. They have a teleconverter that is a 1.4 times zoom, and then they have another one which is a 2 times zoom. Now, there are manufacturers out there that actually build their lenses, some of their higher end lenses, and they build teleconverters right into them. And that's kind of a nice feature. I know Nikon does that. I'm not sure if Canon does off the top of my head, but I know Nikon does that. And it's kind of nice because if you have that lens on your camera and you have a teleconverter built in, you don't have to have it on all the time. You don't have to have it off all the time. It has a little switch right there on it, so you can turn it on and off as you see fit. And that's really kind of convenient, as we're going to discuss, because not every situation in wildlife photography is going to allow you to use a teleconverter, and nor do you want to, because it's really going to degrade your images in many different situations. So it's nice to have that switch where you can just flip it on and off, because otherwise, if you're using the ones that are available to me through the Sony ecosystem, if you want to use the teleconverter, you got to obviously put it on your camera. And if you don't want to use it, then you've got to stop the action and take it off, right? So it's not the end of the world, but it's just obviously far more convenient if it's built into your lens and you can just switch what you're doing with a flip of a switch. So pretty interesting though. One thing I want to say about teleconverters though, before we really get in, the Sony ones, I think they run about $550, and you can either get the 1.4 or like I said, the 2-time zoom with the Sony teleconverters. And I think they're $548 to be exact. So it's a little bit pricey, right? It's a little bit pricey, but it does give you that extra reach. I could, if I was shooting with my 600 millimeter lens and I put that 1.4, I got an 840 millimeter lens now. If I put the 2-time lens on, 2-time zoom on, now I have a 1200 millimeter lens. That's a ton of reach, right? That is a ton of reach, 1200 millimeters. And we're going to talk about the price that comes with that in a second, but I kind of just want you to kind of think about this for a second. For $550, you're getting a lot from that, right? You're getting a lot of extra reach out of your camera lens. So it can be well worth it in certain situations. But don't be romanced by the third-party manufacturers out there who are making teleconverters for your camera brand. Generally speaking, right? And I'm not going to say all in every case, but generally speaking, the build quality of the third-party teleconverters just isn't as good as your original equipment manufacturer. Okay, and many photographers have gone the third-party, route, and what they found is that it broke off their camera mount and caused damage to their camera mount, and of course, the teleconverter itself broke, and so it just became a headache because now the camera's got to be shipped back to be repaired. The money you just spent on the teleconverter is now gone because that's broken. And yes, you can probably save a couple $100s or so by getting a third-party teleconverter. But again, with the build quality being a little less, I really don't think it's worth it. It's not worth taking the risk of damaging your equipment. It's also performance-wise not going to be the same. Keep in mind that a lot of these teleconverters, even when you're using an original equipment manufacturer teleconverter, your autofocus is going to suffer on some level. If you start using third-party teleconverters, I can assure you that your autofocusing system is going to be degraded even more. So you got to be really, really careful around there, because you're sacrificing a lot. You're running a big risk to get into a third-party teleconverter. So try to skip it at all costs. With that being said, let's talk about some of the disadvantages that come with teleconverters. We know the advantage, right? That's obvious. That is the extra reach that we're going to get from our lens. Having another, couple 100 millimeters to up to another 600 millimeters, that's pretty enticing, right? That really piques my interest. I don't know about you, but having 1,200 millimeters of reach is really kind of a nice thought. But let's take a look at those disadvantages so that we understand the cost that comes with using a teleconverter. Not only do you want to steer clear of those third-party teleconverters, but you also don't want to try to beat the system like many other photographers have done. And we've talked about this on previous episodes here on this channel. A lot of photographers will go out and go, wait a minute here. If I can get a 2-time teleconverter that's going to give me this extra reach, what if I get maybe like a cheap 300 millimeter lens, right? I go out, maybe find something in that $400 to $600 range that will give me 300 millimeters. And then what if I just get a teleconverter? I get a 2-time teleconverter. Now I'm up to 600 millimeters. Hey, I'm looking at a 600 millimeter lens that, I own a Sony and I want to get that 200 to 600 lens. That's $2,000. But if I go this way, if I get that cheap 300 millimeter lens and I get a 2-time teleconverter, I've got a 600 millimeter lens now for $1,000. Seems like a pretty good deal. Teleconverters only work well on good glass. You need a good lens to even want to consider buying a teleconverter. I'm not saying this to be harsh. I'm not saying this to deter you from doing it. I'm doing this to save you headaches and money and frustration. A good lens, okay, you got to remember, right? We just talked about how this teleconverter is going to fit between your lens and your camera. A good lens, even that is the quality of that lens is going to be reduced a little bit when you put another piece of equipment between the lens and your camera. It's just the way it goes, right? It's going through another piece of glass that's in the teleconverter, then it's going through your lens. There's a lot of moving parts going on here. So the quality of your pictures will be degraded just a little bit, even with great lenses. So if you put on a crappy lens, an inexpensive lens, I'm telling you, the teleconverter is going to magnify whatever shortcomings that lens has. And in the end, what's going to happen is you're going to go out, you're going to have this 600 millimeters of length. You're going to think all your prayers have been answered. All your problems are solved for getting closer to your subjects. You're going to take a bunch of pictures. You're going to come home. You're going to put them on your computer, and you're just going to scratch your head, and you're going to be going, what did I just do? Why did I do this? This was the worst money I ever spent. I should have just, if I didn't have the $2,000 for the lens I wanted, should have just waited and saved for it. And look, I know that can be hard. Okay, you're talking to Captain Impatient over here. I don't think there's anything I order that I'm not looking for how I can get it here overnight, by 4 a.m, if at all possible. So I understand it's tough to wait for things. I have a huge problem with that. When I want something, I want it, and I want it now. Simple as that. But trust me, it's not worth spending $1,000 on something that you're going to really be miserable with. You'd be better off to save that $1,000. If $2,000 is out of your reach right now, save that $1,000 and then save another $1,000, no matter how long it takes, and get the better equipment. In the interim, if you really want to, rent this lens for a little bit, right? While you're trying to save up. That'll probably cost you maybe $70, $80 to have the lens for a week. You can go out, do some wildlife photography with it. really dedicate time to doing that while you're renting the lens. So there are some other options that you might have. Look at buying used. Go to KEH.com, right? I've talked about these guys before. They're a online marketplace. They sell used camera gear, but it's not like going to eBay or Facebook Marketplace where you got to worry about being scammed, right? These folks are selling certified used equipment. Pretty much everything comes with a 180-day warranty on it. So you have some peace of mind there that if something goes wrong with it, you can return it. But you're going to be able to save several $100s by going used. And I think that's a great way to go if you're looking to get that longer quality glass. And they come with a rating system. So, learn the rating system, understand what it means, and then make a decision when it comes to your purchase that's best for you. So there's a lot of ways that you can go about this. But again, let's circle back to the main point here. Don't buy a teleconverter for an inexpensive lens. You will be miserable. The next big issue that we face when using a teleconverter is the amount of light that's allowed into the camera. So let's take a look at my lens again, right? I'm using that Sony 200 to 600 millimeters, and let's just talk about 600 millimeters. The fastest aperture I have natively on that lens when I'm at 600 millimeters is an f6.3. What happens when we use teleconverters? Well, guess what? We no longer get that aperture. So if we're using the 1.4 teleconverter on our Sony 200, 600 lens, that f6.3 at 600 millimeters, when I put that 1.4 teleconverter on, the fastest aperture I'm now going to have at 600 millimeters is now f9. All right, 6.3 to f9, that is a big loss of light. If I use the 2-time teleconverter, that f6.3 is now going to turn into f13. All right, that is huge. You are going to be losing a ton of light. What does that mean? This is what I was saying a little while ago when I was saying it's nice to have a teleconverter built into your lens, because not every situation allows for or calls for a teleconverter. So you really only want to be using teleconverters when you're in really good light. If you're out there before sunrise, like I often am, or you're out there at dusk, when that sun is going down and things are starting to get a little bit darker, you're not going to be able to use a teleconverter. Everything is just going to be way too dark. If you do, try to do that, you're going to have to bump your ISO up to probably, 51,000. And, then you're just going to have unusable, grainy, noisy images that you're going to be, sickened by. So it's a really tough thing to use in darker situations. But if you're out in bright conditions, good lighting, the teleconverter can really be an advantage because you are going to get that extra reach. But I got to caution you with using it in those darker situations, because it's just a light killer. The next thing that we need to talk about, and I've touched on this a little bit already, is autofocusing. When you put a teleconverter onto your camera, it is going to make your autofocusing a little less responsive. Now, this isn't such a big deal if you're photographing static animals or you're photographing animals that are, moving at a slower rate. But guess what happens when you're out there doing bird photography and you're trying to photograph a bird that's flying rapidly? Going to be really difficult for your camera's autofocus to keep up with that. Not that you can't, not that you won't be able to get good shots, but you do need to go in with the expectation that if you're going to be photographing flying birds or animals that are moving very quickly, especially if they're smaller animals, that when you have a teleconverter on, expect to go back and look at your photos and have a lot more photos that turn out blurry. The next disadvantage with teleconverters is something we talked about in the very beginning of this show, and that is field of view. It's great to have a 600 millimeter lens. And I'm telling you, until you get used to a 600 millimeter lens, when you first get a lens of that focal length, you are going to have a lot of problems at 600 millimeters trying to find your subject in the viewfinder. It's challenging. It's very challenging, especially when we start talking about moving subjects. especially birds. And I do a lot of bird photography, so I can speak to this firsthand. It becomes very difficult to find these birds in the viewfinder at 600 millimeters. So what you typically need to do, one of the techniques that you're going to do if you've never used a 600 millimeter lens before, is you're going to zoom out, right? So I might back off my lens to 200 or 300 millimeters. I'll get my subject in the frame, and then I'll zoom in as I'm tracking them. And it's a much easier and a much more consistent way to get your subject in the frame and get them in focus. So if you add a teleconverter to your lens and you turn it into an 840 millimeter lens, or you turn it in to a 1200 millimeter lens, I can assure you it's nearly impossible to get a moving bird in the frame when you're at those distances. So you're going to have to really back it off. But even at 200, right, you're going to be zoomed into roughly about 300 millimeters with a teleconverter. Yeah, you can certainly frame up a bird at 300 millimeters. That'll be a lot easier. But it's just good to know that your field of view is going to change with a teleconverter on there. The last thing I want to talk about, the last disadvantage I want to talk about when it comes to teleconverters are atmospheric conditions. Another topic we frequently discuss on this channel. Atmospheric conditions, of course, are, the haze, the mist, the fog that exist in the environment when we're out taking pictures. And it's pretty rare that there's not some sort of atmospheric condition going on a daily basis, right? Some days it's obviously not very visible. Some days it is. And some days, it looks pretty clear. You really can't tell if there's any kind of haze in the air. But imagine going out on one of those hot, hazy, and humid summer days, right? You can almost see and feel the haze that exists in the air. Well, that haze and that type of, condition is really going to impact the overall quality of your photos, because it's going to soften your images, right? Especially when you're shooting at greater distances. So think about this. If you put a teleconverter on, you're already degrading your image, but it's also going to take any of those atmospheric conditions that may exist, and it's going to magnify them and make them worse in your photos too. So if you are using that teleconverter because you're trying to get closer to an animal that's further away and you have a lot of haze in the air, you're probably not going to love the images that you're getting out of camera. That teleconverter is really going to struggle dealing with that haze at those longer distances. So you got to be really cautious about when you use the teleconverter. As you can see, right, we've talked about a lot of different situations with teleconverters and how they can really degrade your images. Okay, guys, we're down to number one. We're down to the number one way to get closer to wildlife without physically getting closer. This is a pretty straightforward one, and that is buy a longer lens. All right, so here's the key, right? Buying a longer lens in wildlife photography can be a daunting proposition, because wildlife photography lenses and equipment tends to be pretty specialized, and in turn, it tends to be pretty expensive. Like I said, you can go out and buy a 300 millimeter lens. You might even be able to get a 350, 400 millimeter lens for a pretty inexpensive price, something less than $1,000. But I can promise you that the optical quality of that lens is not going to be fantastic. It might do the trick if you're a wildlife photographer who only goes out a couple times a year and it's, a real low-key hobby for you. But if you're doing it with any kind of seriousness, and I don't mean seriousness as in professional or making money, but seriousness as far as you care about the quality of your photos, then you're not going to be happy with one of these more inexpensive lenses where the optical qualities are suffering. If you want a decent wildlife lens, you're generally looking at least $1,700 to $1,800, and it goes up until, about $15,000 and sometimes even more. Now, you don't need the $15,000 lens, right? I have a $2,000 lens, and the optics on that Sony 200 to 600 lens are just gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. And now that's a cheap lens when I compare it to the Sony 600 prime lens, right? Has a fast aperture of f4. It's a $14,000 lens. So saving $12,000 makes my lens look pretty cheap, right? Reality is though, $2,000 is not cheap. Not everyone has the budget to go out and buy a $2,000 lens. Get that. Now I do wildlife photography more seriously. So I need to invest in that equipment. I have more of a need to do that. For those of you who are just doing it more casually, you need to decide whether or not you can justify that purchase, right? Whether spending $2,000 makes sense to you. But I think you need to prepare yourself that if you want to get closer to the animals by getting a longer lens, don't skimp out by getting a cheap lens. You got to go for the good quality glass because that's the only way getting a longer lens is worth it for you. And like I said, if you're using a 200 to 300 millimeter lens, you will be very happy when you get a 600 millimeter lens because it will bring you a lot closer to the action, a lot closer to the animals. But don't think, and I said this, I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier on in the video, don't think it's going to be the answer to all your prayers. Okay, 600 millimeters, you will like that maybe for a week or two. And then you're going to be back to going, oh man, I wish I could get closer. God damn it, I wish I could get closer. And you're going to still have those same thoughts and those same feelings. I promise you. It's just the way it works out with wildlife photography. All right, guys, those are the 4 ways that you can get closer to wildlife photography without physically getting closer. I think it's important to understand these because I guarantee that pretty much everyone out there is using at least one, if not more, of these techniques. And it's important to understand what the cost of using each of these techniques is. So, because it can really help you with how you photograph your subjects when you're out there doing wildlife photography, right? If you're using that crop sensor mode that we were first talking about earlier on in this video, and I said to you, well, if you want to use it, be prepared for a lot of reduction in your resolution. You may go out there and frame your picture a little bit differently, right? You might figure out, how can I get a little closer to the animal physically without scaring the animal off, right? I just need to get a little closer. Even if it's another, 10, 15 yards closer to the animal. If I can get just a little bit closer, I could use this crop mode. Yes, I'm going to lose a lot of resolution, but if I can get something in the 20s megapixel resolution, I can take that picture, I can frame it perfectly. I won't crop it. I'll have something usable here, right? So you might think a little bit differently when you're out in the field, knowing what the cost is, right? What the cost is for using these different options. Don't think that if you're out there in the field that, I'm not real close to this animal. I'll just take a picture, zoomed into 600 millimeters. They're still really far away, but you know what? I'll just crop the shit out of it later on in post-production. Don't get rid of that mindset. Figure out how to get closer to the animal physically, right? It can be really tough sometimes. It can be really tough because there's a lot of birds and animals out there that are very skittish. And man, it's like they hear you stepping on a blade of grass and they're gone. So I understand that it can be like that, but you're better off to just give up the shot than to try to get something and crop it later on. And you crop so much, you bring the resolution down to about 5 megapixels, and you can't even print the photo in any kind of form. So skip doing that. Think about what you're doing out there. Think about how you're going to get closer to the animals, like we just talked about, right? Without physically getting closer. What techniques are you going to use here? And work your photography style around that so that you can maximize the cost of whatever technique you're using. All right, guys. Hey, thank you so much for spending your time with me. I know this is a little bit of a longer video, but I think this is a really important one because this is something that we're all familiar with. These are techniques that we all need to use. If you found this video helpful, guys, please like it. Subscribe to the channel. There's going to be more videos like this. I think this is good stuff. I think we can learn a lot from these types of shows. Consider subscribing again, please. And thanks again for spending your time with me. And I look forward to seeing all you guys in the next video. But until then, be safe. Have a great holiday. And best wishes with your wildlife photography. Take care.